Hello and welcome back to our second part of the series where we will be focusing on ancient Greece. Here is a timeline of the events that I will be discussing in this video. I'm going to run through them really quickly. 725 to 700 BCE is the earliest known war between Greek city-states. Circa 710 BCE is the earliest examples of hoplite equipment. Circa 650 BCE, we see that they don't have swords. They don't have swords, but they're carrying two spears, one for thrusting and throwing each. And in 492 to 490, that was the first Greco-Persian War. So this is the first time the Persians tried to invade Greece, and the Persians are defeated at the Battle of Marathon. And at 480 BCE, Xerxes launches the second Persian invasion of Greece, and he is defeated at the Battle of Salamis. And the Battle of Thermopylae is also featured in this second invasion. Now, from 431 to 404 BCE, the Athenians and Spartans destroyed each other in the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans ended up being the winner, but in reality, no one won, because it really destroyed both their economies. And Thebes took over, and by 378 BCE, the Thebans destroyed the Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra. And now the Thebans were in charge. And in 338 BCE, the Thebans got thrown over by Philip II of Macedon at the Battle of Chaeronea by feigning withdrawal, and the Theban sacred band is destroyed. And I will talk more about the sacred band in a while. And in 331 BCE, Alexander the Great, Philip II of Macedon's son, battles the Persians at the Battle of Gaugamela, utilizing flexible approaches far in advance of traditional hoplite tactics. Now, here's a map of ancient Greece, and from it I will point out the important things. Here's Sparta in the south. You have Corinth, or here's Argos and Corinth here. You have Athens here. You have Delphi here. You have Mount Olympus here, where they believe the gods lived. You have Crete here with Knossos and the Palace of Knossos. And here is Asia Minor, and this was Persian territory back in the day. Now we will be discussing Greek phalanxes. The earliest examples of all this, we can see that the phalanxes were normally 8 men deep, and the spears were normally around 100 inches in length, and only the first 3 ranks could reach the enemy line. So, you know, those are the only 3 that could do any damage. But the good thing about a phalanx is that your left side was fully protected because of the hoplon, or shield, of the man next to you. So because of that, the phalanxes tended to drift to the right because each man tried to edge behind the shield of his neighbor. And here you can see a Greek hoplon, or hoplite, with a hoplon, the shield, and dory. Now, the shield, they didn't have them wider than 3 feet in diameter. That was the biggest they ever got. They were made from wood, covered in bronze, and reinforced with bronze around the rims. It had an antilabe, which was a handle right here where you could hold on to it, and it allowed the soldier to carry a weapon and a shield in the same hand. So basically, he could have this shield on and hold a sword on it, while at the same time using a spear. That's pretty cool, right? Now, here you can see a xiphos from the early 6th century BCE, and the xiphos was the sword most commonly used by the hoplites. And the blade swelled to a wide point near the tip, which you can see here, and that made it good for thrusting in combat. And it was carried in a sheath worn under the left arm. And below it, you can see an example of a kopis, which first appeared in the late 6th century BCE, and this one is kind of like a model from the 5th century BCE, and these were slashing weapons. They were designed to inflict wounds with a downward slash, and the convex blade and back were designed to add weight to the weapon toward its tip. So they really wanted to inflict some damage on that down slash. Now here's the shield I discussed earlier, the aspis, or hoplon as it was known. Now here you can see a bronze cuirass from the 8th century BCE. Now these were custom made to the person who wore them. If you were a person trying to get a bronze cuirass, you'd have to go to a blacksmith and get it custom made. You couldn't just go out and buy one. But these fell out of fashion around 500 BCE. They didn't really use them anymore after then. Here's a Corinthian helmet from the 7th century BCE. It was the most common form of a hoplite helmet. It was protected the whole head with a little T-shape opening for the eyes, nose, and mouth. And there was an inner lining that cushioned the wearer's head. You know, they didn't just stick their head in there with the metal banging around. That would suck. Now, here is the Battle of Marathon, which was the result of the first Greco-Persian invasion, or the first Persian invasion of Greece. And the thing about the Battle of Marathon is their leader, Miltiades, had his men just outside of archer range, just outside of the range of the enemy archers. And he organized his men, and then the lightly armed hoplites charged the larger, more numbered Persian soldiers, because the Persians outnumbered the Greeks by a lot. And these guys were charging them, and the Persians thought these guys were crazy because they were lightly armed, running across a field towards a huge army. They thought, what the fuck? Like, really? Like, but the thing is, once they got into combat, they realized that even though they were lightly armored, they were still armored, and the Persians weren't, like, at all. So that led to the left flank collapsing. The left flank dropped, the right flank dropped, and all that was left was a little tiny Persian unit in the center that was holding out. And the Greek unit from the front and the Greek unit from the left and right flanks closed in on it, and it was not pretty. Here's a depiction of the Battle of Marathon, where you can see the Greeks with their armor and the Persians without their armor. And that makes a big, big difference. Now, everyone knows these guys. Oh boy, yep, everyone knows these guys. The Second Persian Invasion of Greece, the Battle of Thermopylae, the brave 300, who stand against Xerxes and his evil Persians. Well, it really wasn't like that. They didn't look like this. They didn't look anything like this, in fact. Hollywood is so fucking crazy. I have no idea why. Like, this is what they really look like. Like, doesn't that look cooler? Like, what the fuck? I think that's way cooler. You know, their armor, they got spears, they got shields. I mean, they are fucking armed to the teeth. You know, they're ready for combat. That is much cooler in my opinion. But another thing to note about the Battle of Thermopylae, which occurred in 480 BC, is that there were other Greeks there. It wasn't just the Spartans. There was Corinthians as well. But they had to leave. And that's why the Spartans get such the glory and myth and legend that they do. Because there weren't 300, but there were it might have been 300. A few number of Spartans who stood and defended themselves against the Persians. And the problem with that was on the second day there was a traitor from the Greek camp who went to Persia and went up to Xerxes and said, "Hey, I can tell you, I can help you out." And Xerxes was like, "Alright." So he leads them all the way around this mountain goat path. And the next day when the Greeks woke up, they were like, "What the hell?" Because they were surrounded on two sides. And so they just fought to the death, and that was it. And the thing is, they were so close to winning too, because I mean, on the first day of the Battle of Thermopylae, the Greeks or the Persians were losing so many men that Xerxes was said to have stood up 3 or 4 times from his chair to watch, because he couldn't believe how many men he was losing. It was like a God, a shredder. That's what it was. It was just a meat grinder. Props to those Spartans, man, and their armor. Now, Battle of Thermopylae goes hand in hand with the Battle of Salamis. They occurred around the same time and was led by Xerxes, except they weren't fighting. Uh, they weren't fighting the Spartan king. They were fighting Themistocles, the Greek admiral. And the Greek fleet had about 370 triremes, which is a ton. But the Persians had about 800. So, can you imagine? 800 ships versus 370? That's a huge fucking battle. And what happened was, Themistocles lured the Persians into this narrow inlet here, and they couldn't move around, and the Greeks just started ramming them and boarding their ships and just slaughtering them one by one by one by one by one. And the Battle of Salamis was the very first great naval battle recorded in history. So, very important battle, the Battle of Salamis. Here you can see a depiction of it with the Greek trireme smashing into a Persian ship, or galley, I should say. And you can imagine the terror and horror that must have been felt by everyone fighting in this. Especially, I mean, can you imagine not being able to swim, being on one of those ships? You'd be terrified, let me tell you. The ones who could swim, they'd still be terrified, because a sinking ship out in the middle of the sea, it's still easy to drown. So, very, 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 very awesome battle. In our words, for them it was horrible. Here's a Greek trireme, and the Greek trireme was the most advanced ship of its time. It had the 3 rows of rowers, 1, 2, 3, hence the name trireme, tri meaning 3. And they had the little beak up front in front of the ship for boarding, or not boarding, for ramming, to ram the enemy ship and sink it. So they'd use that little thing to ram into the vessel and sink the enemy ship. And they did a pretty good job of it too. Now, here is a map of the Athenian Empire in 431 BC, which is the date that the Peloponnesian War began. And you can see why Sparta was so pissed at Athens, because after their victory over Persia, Athens went crazy, and they just started going and land grabbing like crazy. And the Spartans were like, "What the hell are you doing?" You know, Athens was like, "We're making our empire. What are you doing?" The Spartans was like, "Fuck you. We're declaring war. We're not gonna let you have an empire." And what do you know? The Spartans won. because, you know, they're Sparta. They literally train from, what, the age of 7. They're thrown into barracks, military barracks. Can you imagine being 7 years old and then they're like, all right, time to go to boot camp. I mean, Jesus, they're military all the way. But no, Spartans won, but really no one won because it crippled the economies of both Athens and Sparta. And pretty much like exactly right when Sparta won in 404 BC, they started being challenged by the Thebans, led by Epaminondas. And here's a map of the Peloponnesian War. It shows you how widespread it was. It went all the way to Syracuse, to the Asia Minor, Greece. Very widespread war. And there were innovations that came about because of the Peloponnesian War. Innovations that led to archers and peltasts being used much more widely than they were before. And here you can see some examples of those types of troops. Peltasts would be the javelin men throwing their javelins, and you had slingers and archers and all kinds of ranged troops that became more important. But pretty much right after Sparta won, you know, the war, like I said, in 404 BC, they were challenged by the Thebans, and eventually Epaminondas gathered his Theban army against the Spartans, and at the Battle of Leuctra, he routed them. And there's the reason that he won at the Battle of Leuctra is because he stacked a column of men like, how many? It was really deep. I think it was like 50-man deep column. It was a seriously deep column, and they had their the sacred band of Thebes. So that helped too, because that was an elite force of 150 homosexual pairs, and they were lovers. And these 150 homosexual lover couples would fight to the death for each other. That was the theory. And so that's why they were put into the elite force known as the Sacred Band. And basically, when the infantry hit the Spartan line, they smashed the Spartan right wing. And the Spartans' 12-deep formation on their right wing couldn't sustain the heavy impact of the 50-deep column that the Thebans were, you know, bringing to the party. So the Spartans was hurled back with the loss of about 1,000 men, and 400 of whom were some of Sparta's most experienced soldiers, including the king Cleombrotus I. So the Spartan king lost his life, the Spartans lost their dominance, and Thebes becomes the power. So it went from Athens to Sparta to Thebes. But Theban dominance was short-lived. Wait, yeah. Well, oh wait, yeah. Before I get into that, here's a picture of the Battle of Leuctra. That's the Spartans getting fucked by the Thebans. Here's Macedonia, and this is why the reign of Thebes was short-lived, because Macedon was on the rise under Philip II, Alexander the Great's father, and he had been conquering territory up north while everyone else was bickering down south. And at the Battle of Chaeronea on August 2nd, 338 BC, what happened is the Thebans and Macedonians went to war. The only formal account that we have of this battle says that once the battle was joined, the battle was hotly contested for a long time, and many fell on both sides. So the struggle permitted hopes of victory to both But young Alexander the Great, his heart setting on showing his father to his prowess, he wants to show his daddy that he's a brave soldier, succeeded in rupturing the Theban line, aided by his companions, and eventually put the Greek right wing to flight, and Philip advanced in person against the Greek left, who was also put to flight. So you can see Alexander and Philip. And here's a depiction of the Battle of Chaeronea, the moment where Macedon takes over Thebes as the dominant power. And the thing is about Macedon and Thebes, the Thebans had increased the phalanx to 12 ranks or more, and they made much more greater use of cavalry, and they used their sacred band. But the sacred band was wiped out, and Chaeronea was a dark day for the Thebans. And if it's like adding insult to injury, the Thebans' great achievement was adding 12 ranks or more in cavalry in combat, but the Macedonians won up them and made the phalanxes 16 ranks. And he also made his soldiers carry the sarissa, a longer spear which was like 20 feet long, which allowed the first 5 rows to hit the enemy. So remember when the first phalanxes could only have the first 3 rows doing any action? Well, Philip of Macedon made it so that you got 5 rows doing action with longer spears. And these armored phalangites kept enemy infantry pinned down, while heavy cavalry, slingers, and peltasts and the like launched their attack. And here is a picture of Macedonian companion cavalry. This is the type of cavalry that Alexander the Great would have rode with. This was their elite warriors. The Thebans had their sacred band, Macedonians had their companion cavalry, and they would prove themselves quite efficient at not just Chaeronea, but in later battles. As you can see, Alexander the Great was going on to conquest a lot of stuff. That's why he's called Alexander the Great. He took over Thebes, and then he was like, man, I got Greece. Let's take over the world. And then he just went, I mean, he went ape shit. Like, he went, like, it was like, I'll give you an example of how it was. His generals were like, yeah, Battle of Chaeronea, we're awesome. And they're like, oh, Granicus River, we're awesome. Alright, we're marching. Yeah, we got Asia Minor, sweet. Alright. Okay, we won the Battle of Isis. Or Isis. I don't want to say ISIS because, modern day connotations. But Battle of Isis. And then they're like, okay, we're in Egypt. Why are we in Egypt? And then they're like, okay, we're winning at Gaugamela, but why? Why? Ooh, Babylon looks cool. And then they're going, okay, we're going really far out now. Okay. Whoa, what the fuck are you doing? There's elephants and shit, man. I don't want to go to India. Dude, what the fuck? Where are we going? I want to go home. That's basically what happened to Alexander the Great. And his generals just had enough one day, and they literally just told him, dude, we're not going to follow you anymore. Like, we're going home with or without you. And Alexander had no choice. He was super pissed, though. In fact, he was so pissed that on the way back, he marched his army through a massive desert, causing a ton of his soldiers to die. And he did that. Some people say he did it on purpose, just because they had to march back home. He's like, oh, you want to march back home? Okay, instead of taking ships and just like, you know, sailing all the way home. I'm gonna march you through a fucking desert. But before Alexander the Great's army abandoned him, and before, you know, he had gone on these massive conquests, there was the Battle of Issus. And basically what happened at the Battle of Issus is Macedonian forces had a phalanx in the center and cavalry on the sides, and they approached the army of Darius, which was drawn up on the opposite bank of the Pinarus River, which you see here. And Alexander led the charge across the river, shattering the Persian left wing, right here, before turning against the Greek mercenaries who formed the Persian center, here. And Darius escaped in the confusion, but his family was captured. So, like, Darius himself got away, but the emperor, the emperor of Persia, his family got captured. His wife, I don't know if he had any kids, but if he did have kids, they got captured too. His entire family was captured. The Macedonians claimed to have only lost 450 men, with Alexander himself being wounded. Most of the Persians retreated to safety, while the Macedonians spent their time sacking Darius's camp. And here is a mosaic of the Battle of Issus, in which supposedly Alexander and Darius were supposed to have, you know, had a moment with each other on the field of battle. Whether or not this is true, we can only speculate, but it still makes for a pretty awesome mosaic. Now, the Battle of Gaugamela is what was the final decisive blow against the Persian Empire, because Persia was hurt by the Battle of Issus, but it wasn't defeated. After all, Darius escaped, you know, and if the Emperor of Persia is still around leading armies, they're not defeated. So Alexander the Great had to make another assault, and in modern-day Iraq, he made his assault at the Battle of Gaugamela. Now, his generals wanted to do a night attack the night before, but Alexander said, fuck that, because he didn't want to steal his victory. How honorable is that, right? Darius, though, was paranoid, and he kept his people up all night. So, while Darius's army was up all night, watching and keeping guard, Alexander's troops were sleeping. And battle began. The Persians were already there. The Greeks arrived late because Alexander overslept. You know, the Macedonians were really sleeping that day. You know, and the phalanx moves towards the center, right here, as you can see, of the Persian line. The Greeks advanced with the wings at 45-degree angles, right here, the wings, to lure the Persian cavalry to attack. And while the phalanxes battled the Persian infantry, Darius sent a large part of his cavalry and some infantry to attack Parmenian's forces on the left. And those are just the opening movements. As you can see, here's the attack on Parmenion. And Alexander rides all the way to the edge of the right flank, accompanied by his companion cavalry, and his plan is to draw as much of the Persian cavalry as possible to the flanks. And Darius launches his chariots, but his new tactics destroy most of them. And Alexander attacks the Persian center, but his left is pressed hard by Persian cavalry, and a gap opens, and his camp is attacked. Right here, boom, the gap in the Persian line. Alexander went for it, and the Persians just fled. They were like, fuck this, you know, and they all took off. And Alexander wanted to keep going after Darius. You know, he wanted Darius himself. He wanted to take that dude alive. But he abandoned the chase to help out his left, you know, because if he hadn't, he might have lost. Well, he wouldn't have lost. He probably would have won anyways. But still risky stuff, you know. In battle, you make moments, snap, you know, quick decision, decisive battles. And thus, the empire of the Persians was handed to Alexander the Great. And the Greeks now controlled everything from Greece and Asia Minor to Egypt and Macedonia, or not Macedonia, Mesopotamia and Persia, Parthia, Bactria, and he bordered right up to India. And finally, I will leave you with this timeline illustrating the main points of what we have covered in today's lesson on military history. I hope you have enjoyed this lesson on military history, and join us for the next episode, which will be focusing on the Roman Empire. So, yeah, stay tuned and have an awesome day.